Well, good morning. Everybody keeps telling me that the summer keeps flying by and we're back to September today, and I'd say most years I feel the same way. I think that summer just flies by because I just can't, I always enjoy summertime camping and relaxing, and this year I feel like the summer just crawled by because I'm anticipating an event coming up in my life, and it's like usually summer just whips by. I'm like, oh, come on, 69 days left, let's go. But we're here, we're finally to fall. It's September. It's kind of like to me, it's like the beginning of a new year. So it's exciting. In 9 days, we have youth starting up. It's going to be, we're going to back in the rhythm of routine with youth every week. And we, like Phil was mentioning, we have an exciting event planned for our kickoff. We're making it a mystery because I think everything is more exciting when it's a surprise. I'm not sure if the kids would agree. They kind of get annoyed, I think, when I think that way, but that's okay. And parents, just a little maybe disclaimer to you, it's a perfectly safe event. It's not going to be anything crazy, but make sure your kids bring their waivers, okay? That would be much appreciated. So this morning I want to start off talking a little bit about grandparents. I don't know why this year I've been thinking a little bit more about grandparents more this year than other years. This year was my dad's 90th birthday, so we celebrated with my grandpa this year. We had a surprise visitor at his birthday party. An Elvis impersonator showed up, and we're like, oh, Grandpa wanted Elvis at his birthday party. That's kind of sweet for Grandpa turning 90. It was an exciting event, very surprising, but it was sweet. And my mom's mom this year, my grandma, had her 90th birthday. And we surprised her. A couple of her grandchildren came out from Ontario, and she didn't know we were coming out. So we kind of had this year of like celebration for grandparents. And it's exciting just to think of all the life they've lived and the testimony they have in their life. And I think as the older I get, the more I appreciate my grandparents. I know Courtney is very close with her grandparents, and she's like literally calls them probably a couple times a week, like always keeping in front of them, like, man, that's impressive. Like I definitely don't do that. But she definitely has this value of grandparents in her life. So I think this last year I've really learned to appreciate my grandparents. And so probably about 11 years ago, my mom's dad, my grandpa, passed away. And the last couple years of his life, he was diagnosed with this disease of Alzheimer's. And if you guys know what Alzheimer's is, it's a form of dementia. You forget a lot. And in some cases of Alzheimer's, it actually changes your personality a little bit. And I remember Grandpa, in the last couple years of his life, he started to have a personality change. If you knew my grandpa, which many of you guys probably don't because he doesn't live around here, but he was a very soft-spoken, gentle man, and he was very caring towards us. I remember going golfing with Grandpa. He'd always take me and Brett golfing, and it was really frustrating because he would me and Brett could hit it probably 3 times as far as him, but kind of off in every direction, and he would hit it 150 yards down every time, and he'd beat us, and it was so frustrating because you could hit it so much farther than him, but he was so consistent. But anyways, that's just a rant. He was a really good man, and I remember in the last couple of years he came and he was in the hospital here in Crystal City because I guess there was more open beds here and Mom was close by here or whatever. But we would go in the afternoons or evenings, we'd go hang out with Grandpa at the hospital, and his personality had changed to he was a bit more, I would say, mean. And which is completely out of character for Grandpa. We would play this game, this marbles game, where you have to try and get these marbles all the way around the board. And if you land on somebody else's marble, they have to go back to the beginning or whatever. And I'll never forget. It was I know Sandy was there, I was there, and I know Grandpa. That's all I can remember for sure. But I remember Grandpa, he rolled the dice and he landed right where Sandy's marble was. And he took his marble at 1, 2, 3, and then looked Sandy square in the eye and knocked her marble right across the room. And we looked at Grandpa Grandpa, and that's not very nice. But it was kind of funny. I think Sandy even teared up a little bit. To me, it was funny because it's just completely out of personality for Grandpa to do that because this disease had really taken a hold of his body, and the person he was is a lot different than the person he used to be. And if you've experienced it, it's a really sad disease. Grandpa had a disease that he couldn't control, and he was kind of helpless and oblivious to what was going on in his life. And I think sometimes in our lives, we fall captive to a similar disease of a spiritual Alzheimer's. Instead of the disease choosing us, we choose to have the disease. So the disease is of forgetting who God is and what he has done for us. Spiritual Alzheimer's is the disease of forgetting who God is and what he has done for us. And here are a few symptoms of this spiritual Alzheimer's. Not having much to do with God until life gets hard or difficult. Ignoring God's commands on how to live a Christian life, or just choosing the commands that you feel like applying to your life. Reacting with fear and anxiety when things get hard in life. Forgetting to spend time with God. Letting our hearts be drawn to false gods, whether that's TV, social media, money, or anything that steals our hearts. And I think to a certain extent, we can all relate to this spiritual Alzheimer's, where we forget about who God is and what he has done in our life. And this isn't a disease that just has been like newly created. This disease has been around since the creation of humanity. It's a disease we see all the way through the Old Testament. A few months ago, one day I was getting up, I was going to work, and Courtney sent me this text. She says, "Scott, I read Nehemiah chapter 9 this morning, and it was unbelievable." I'm like, Nehemiah chapter 9? Like, I know chapter 1 is like pretty cool, where like Nehemiah leaves the king to like go back to Jerusalem and rebuild these walls. In chapter 6, they face opposition, and they are resilient, and they like persevere through it. I'm like, Nehemiah chapter 9, does Nehemiah have 9 chapters? Like, I never read this Nehemiah chapter 9, but she's like, yes, Scott, like Nehemiah chapter 9, like it's a really, really, really cool book. I'm like, okay, well, I guess I should probably read this book. So like when I got home from work, or the next morning, whatever, I read through Nehemiah chapter 9. And it's a really, really cool story of like Israel after they have come back 70 years after being in exile. They come back to Jerusalem, they rebuild the walls, they rebuild their homes, they rebuild the temple, and then Nehemiah gathers all the people up together in the city, and he recounts all of the history of the Israelites all the way through the Old Testament, from the Exodus all the way through, and he talks about how God was faithful, right? And he brings them all the way through. And we're going to read Nehemiah chapter 9, because I think it's a bit of a long read, but it's a really, really good story of what Nehemiah said to the people. So if you can get to Nehemiah halfway through, chapter 9, halfway through verse 5, we're going to start. I'm going to go for a bit here, so maybe just bear with me. So hopefully you have a Bible. If not, borrow one from your neighbor or get on your phone. Do whatever you got to do. Sorry, I don't have it on the screen. All right, here we go. So Nehemiah chapter 9, halfway through verse 5, it says, Blessed be your glorious name, and may it be exalted above all blessings and praise. You alone are God. You made the heavens, even the highest heavens, and all their starry hosts, the earth and all that is on it, seas and everything that is on them. You give life to everything, and the multitudes of heaven worship you. You are the Lord who chose Abram and brought him out of Ur of the Chaldeans, and you named him Abraham. You found his heart faithful to you, and you made him a servant. With him, you made a covenant with him to give to his descendants in the land of the Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, Jebusites, Girgashites. You have kept your promises because you are righteous. You saw the suffering of your forefathers in Egypt, and you heard their cry in the Red Sea. You sent miraculous signs and wonders against Pharaoh, against all of his officials and all the people in his land. For you knew how arrogantly the Egyptians treated them, and you made a name for yourself, which remains to this day. You divided the sea before them, so that they passed through it on dry land. But you hurled their pursuers into the depths like a stone into the mighty waters. By day you led them with a pillar of a cloud, and by night with a pillar of fire, to give them light on the way they were to take. You came down on Mount Sinai. You spoke to them from the heaven, and you gave them regulations and laws that are just and right, and decrees and commands that are good. You made known to them your holy Sabbath, and gave them the commands and decrees and laws through your servant Moses. In their hunger you gave them bread from heaven, and in their thirst you brought water from the rock. You told them to go into the land and to take possession of it, that you had sworn to them with an uplifted hand to give them. But they, our forefathers, became arrogant and stiff-necked and did not obey your commands. They refused to listen and failed to remember the miracles you performed among them. They became stiff-necked and in their rebellion appointed a leader in order to return to their slavery. But you were a forgiving God, a gracious and compassionate, slow to anger and abounding in love, Therefore you did not desert them, even when they cast themselves an image of a calf and said, "This is your God who brought you up out of Egypt," or even when they committed awful blasphemies. Because of your great compassion, you did not abandon them in the desert. By day, the pillar of cloud did not cease to guide them on their path, nor the pillar of fire by night to shine the light on the way they were to take. You gave them your good spirit to instruct them. You did not withhold their manna from their mouths. And you gave them water for their thirst. 40 years you sustained them in the desert. They lacked nothing. Their clothes did not wear out, nor did their feet become swollen. You gave them kingdoms and nations, allotting to them even the foremost frontiers. They took over the country of Sihon and the king of Heshbon, the country of Og of Bashan. You made their sons as numerous as the stars in the sky and brought them into the land that you told their fathers to enter and possess. Their sons went in and took possession of the land. You subdued before them the Canaanites who lived in the land. You handed the Canaanites over to them, along with their kings and the peoples of the land, to deal with them as they pleased. They captured fortified cities and fertile land and took possession of the houses filled with all the good things, wells already dug, vineyards, olive groves, and fruit trees in abundance. They ate and were filled and well-nourished. They reveled in your great goodness. But they were disobedient and rebelled against you. They put your law behind their backs. They killed your prophets who had admonished them in order to turn them back to you. They committed awful blasphemies. So you handed them over to the enemy who oppressed them. But when they were oppressed, they cried out to you. From heaven you heard them, and in your great compassion you gave them deliverers who rescued them from the hand of their enemies. But as soon as they were at rest, they again did what was evil in your sight. They abandoned them and to the hand of their enemies, so that they ruled over them. And when they cried out to you, you heard them from heaven, and in your great compassion you delivered them time after time. And we'll stop there. But it goes on and on about how God was faithful to the Israelites over and over and over again, and how the Israelites constantly fell back into their old ways until they reached a new low, and then God brought them back. So Nehemiah, first of all, there's a Harvard professor that once said, "Those who do not learn from history are doomed to repeat it." Right? Those who do not learn from history are doomed to repeat it. And Nehemiah clearly got this. Nehemiah understood that if the Israelites did not learn from the past sins of the Israelites and the constant cycle that the Israelites were going through, that the Israelites of that day were going to repeat the same thing over and over and over again. And Nehemiah wanted Israel to know that who God had been is the same God that he was today, that God did not change. And even though they fall back into the same pattern in their life, God was remaining faithful to them. So on our missions trip last year, and we were at SOAR, one of our students, we always get together every evening, one of our students was sharing, and he was talking about how he shared with his group what he called the apostasy cycle. And he articulated this thought so well on the trip that he described how often in our lives we are often like the Israelites, right? We see God act. We see God come through for us. We're amazed at his goodness, his love, and his care for us. And it leads us into wanting to believe and know God in every area of our lives. But then as life goes on and life becomes mundane and new struggles come and the everyday things of life go on, and we kind of slowly forget about God, and what God did for us becomes memories that grow fainter and fainter. And as these troubles arise in our life, we forget about what God has done, and we begin to doubt that he could ever do that again. And we sink into this deep, new low, right? And we try and doing things and getting things out our own way, but it doesn't work. Then once we hit this new low, we cry out to God, and he reaches down, and he brings us back, and our faith is restored, at least for a while. Right? And it's this constant cycle that he described of how we go through life and we see God and we forget God and we struggle, we try to do things our own way, and then God brings us back, and there's this cycle that goes on and on in our lives. So, I have 4 different things that we can learn from Nehemiah's story that help us to get out of this cycle of spiritual Alzheimer's. Lesson number 1 is God doesn't abandon us. I think we see very clearly as we recount through the story of the Old Testament that God does not ever abandon the Israelites. Even though they might feel like they've been abandoned, God does not abandon the Israelites. As humans, I find we tend to listen to our feelings a lot, right? If I feel like God isn't here, if I feel like I'm not being heard, I assume that is the truth, even though our feelings do not accurately portray reality. Right? As we read through Nehemiah 9, you can see over and over and over again how God is faithful, even though Israel didn't feel like he was. When we read through there, you see all these you words, right? You sent miracles. You came down on Mount Sinai and spoke to them from heaven. You are a forgiving God. You did not abandon them in the desert. You heard them in your great compassion. You gave them deliverers. You warned them to return. In your great mercy, you did not put an end to them. We see these over and over and over again, all the way through that chapter of you, God, are faithful. You did this for them, right? And whether we feel like it or not, God is faithful. Whether I feel like God right now in my situation is here with me, doesn't change the fact that he is, right? And I think this is hard because God is invisible, right? Very, very few men in the history of humanity have ever got to see God, right? We can't just see like a physical presence of God right here that I feel like God is with me, but God's invisible. We can see his acts around us, but since he's so hard to see, right? Sometimes it's hard to believe that God is with us, but we can see through history that God is faithful and does not abandon us. Lesson number 2 is our human tendency is to forget God and to drift away, right? You don't have to be taught how to forget following the rules, or as children, you don't have to teach children to disobey, right? As humans, we have a sinful nature. And we don't have to teach us to drift away from God. We do that all on our own. And it's not really an excuse, but it is a reality. As we read through Nehemiah 9, we can see all the they statements, right? All the they, our forefathers, became arrogant and stiff-necked and did not obey. They refused to listen and failed to remember the miracles you performed. They cast for themselves an image of a calf. They were disobedient and rebelled. They, again, did what was evil in your sight, and they turned their back on you. Right? Over and over again, you can see how the people of Israel, turned their back on God. Over and over again. And sometimes I think, man, am I really like the Israelites? They literally built a golden calf when, Moses was up getting the 10 Commandments. If they had just come through the Red Sea, why would they build a golden calf? It seems preposterous that they would do something like that. And I would never do that, right? And then I started to think this week, I'm if you think about it, all the nations around Israel, they all had idols, right? Their cultural norm was to worship idols, as their God, right? All these other nations, they had these idols. So for Israel, when they felt like God wasn't there, the cultural norm was for them to build an idol, to worship, to give credit to, right? And so I started to think, in my life, I find myself, when I drift away from God and I have trouble struggling, I usually default to the cultural norm. Right? Whether that's putting my trust in wealth, possessions, I don't know, things that I can control, right? That's the cultural norm to do today is rather than trust God to put your trust in whatever is cultural normal. Maybe it isn't to build an idol and to worship an idol, but it is whatever is culturally normal today. So the human tendency is to be forgetful and to drift away. That's lesson number 2. Lesson number 3 is it doesn't have to be this way, right? If we kept reading in Nehemiah chapter 10, Nehemiah chapter 10 is probably one of the most encouraging chapters in the Bible. Because after Nehemiah chapter 9, they recount all the history of the Israelites' past. Nehemiah chapter 10, we won't read it because it's also long. But it's just basically a commitment of Israel giving their lives as an oath, we promise to follow you. We promise to obey your commands. And they have this nation that's been reborn back into Jerusalem, and they're we will promise, we've seen the past, and we promise to move forward in hope and in following your ways, because we know the past. And it's really exciting to read, right? So we might ask the question, how do we get out of this cycle? How do I myself break this cycle in my life, right? What I've started to do in my life is I take time to write down my own Nehemiah chapter 9. I take time to write down the stories in my life where I have seen God act, where I see I know that there's times that God in my life has like came through and like when I had no other like options, and God's like came through, and I write them down, and I recount them, and I can fill pages and pages of all these times that I know where I've seen God. It's like I titled it Scott's Nehemiah chapter 9, right? And it's like these times where you can look back and you can see so clearly who God is and what He's done in my life, so that when I don't feel like it, I like God is close, I can go there and I say like, oh no, I do know that God has been close. So take time to do this. Write this down. Take a moment to look back on God's fingerprints that are on your life. Remember how God has protected you from making a shipwreck of your life. Remember how God graciously let you grow up in a godly family. Remember how God awakened you to the ugliness of your sin. Remember how you walked away from a terrible car crash. Remember how you had mentors and key friends to guide you in your faith. Remember how God sustained you during that tough school year. Remember how God miraculously healed you. Remember how that impossible prayer request that God answered. Remember how you had no money and an envelope just showed up in the mail with the exact amount you needed. Remember how the gospel came alive to you as it never had before. Remember God. The antidote to the spiritual Alzheimer's is making an effort to recall and remember God's gracious deliverance. The fact that you, a sinner who was an enemy of God, are now beloved child is a miracle. Don't let that wonder fade. Remember. Let this act of remembering awaken you a joy in God that is deep, and a deep sense of gratitude that God knows you and loves you and keeps you. When we remember, we can have victory over falling back into that cycle. Lesson number 4, we have to apply what we learn. And I can't emphasize how important this is. We have to apply what we learn. After chapter 9, we read the Israelites confess their sins and they make a new covenant with the Lord. And they rededicate themselves to following the Lord and make oaths affirming their commitment in following in His ways. And it's exciting to see how Israel understands who God is and how much He loves them and how He has provided for them and how quickly they desire to follow Him with their life. And between chapters 9 and chapters 12, you see them living this out, right? They're doing all the right things. They're doing all these things that you would do after you remembered who God is and how He's been faithful in their lives. And if only Nehemiah had 12 chapters. If only that was like the end of the book. And they lived happily ever after, right? Following God's plans that was good for their life. But we come to chapter 13. And I don't know if you guys, I don't have time to read all this section, but in chapter 13, between 12 and chapter 13, Nehemiah, he takes off and he goes back to Babylon, and he has to do some business with the king that let him go to Jerusalem. So he's gone for about a year to 2 years. They don't really know exactly, but he's gone for a period of time. And when he comes back in chapter 13, he finds that they've completely neglected the entire thing that they had just planned to do. It took less than a year, and they had completely forgotten all these things that they had committed to. Nehemiah returns, and he's distraught, and he pleads with them. And it says he literally went around and beat them and pulled out their hair, telling them, like, look at what you are doing. You are not following what you just planned. And he's beside himself, and he passionately pleads with them. Like, remember Solomon. Remember, he was the king. Remember how he was led astray by marrying foreign women. They led him to their different gods. Like, you have all this information right in front of you. Why would you let that go? Like, why would you not keep living the way God wants you to do? And when the book ends, it's frustrating and it's sad. It's such a sad ending, because here's this chosen nation. They're finally back after exile, where they probably all lost members of their family, and they're back where God planted them. They have the temple, they have their homes, and they have the walls around their city, and they're finally back. They just went through this, and in a matter of a year, they fall away from God, and they start doing whatever they choose to do. And the God doesn't abandon them, but the God they just recommitted themselves to follow, He's still with them. So what can we learn from this? What do we do with the end of this story? What do we do with Nehemiah chapter 13? A few months ago, Court and I were talking about Nehemiah chapter 9, and we were kind of just recounting through some of the stories in our lives where like Nehemiah, or where God had just been very present in our lives. And last July of 2017, Courtney had this bad accident, right, where like this fire blew out of the barbecue. She burned her arm, and I went down to visit her. I remember we were talking about how a year ago we had all these prayers that we were praying in the hospital for healing and for like our relationship and all these different things that we were so uncertain that we didn't know the answer to. And we were talking about, man, how faithful God had been over the last year. And we had this really, really good conversation. And later on that evening, we had a very different conversation, which resulted in me like really struggling with the fear and anxiety of like our future. And like I didn't know so much, and like it just really weighed on me. And I'll never forget, Courtney, she like looked at me and she said, Scott, like we just talked about this. Like, you know all the good things that God has done in our lives. Like, you know them. But you fail to apply them to your own life. I'm like, shoot, like, she's right. And it hit me really hard. But she was right, as they say most wives often are. But I was just like the Israelites of Nehemiah's time, right? I was just like them, where I knew that God had been faithful in my life, but then I forget it, and I fall into that fear and anxiety, and I let that rule instead of what actually is true, and I know what is actually right. If we are just reminded of God's faithfulness, but then fail to apply that faith when we need it the most, there's actually very little point in remembering it. If we are just reminded of God's faithfulness, but fail to apply that faith when we need it the most, there's very little point in remembering that God has been faithful. You look at the Israelites, it was great that they remembered, that they took time to remember, but if they didn't actually apply that to their life and live a life where they actually needed, when they needed that faith, they kind of end up just slipping back into the same thing. If we don't apply what we know to our lives, it doesn't actually help us just to remember. So as we conclude this morning, remember what the Lord has done in your life. Recommit yourself to following Him. And then when the rubber meets the road and the Lord asks you to have faith and trust in Him, don't fall back into your old ways. As important as chapter 9 of Nehemiah is in remembering God's faithfulness, if we don't apply it to our lives, we end up in chapter 13. May we see God's faithfulness, and may we be reminded of His love and His care for His sons and daughters. And despite our feelings and circumstances, may we live in a way that reflects our understanding